As Boris began hustling out the main doors of Diamond University, all the students followed behind him. Norman ducked through the crowd. He found Lizzie and Patrick walking near the edge, careful to avoid Danny at all costs. When he reached them, Lizzie grabbed Norman's head by the shoulder. "Norman. Oh my notch, I'm not sure what to say. What were you thinking back there with Danny?" she demanded. "I was thinking of a way to walk off not looking like a wimp, and that was the first thing that came to my mind." "Yeah?" Norman tried walking faster, but both Lizzie and Patrick stayed in step with him. The three of them walked behind the crowd until they had made their way out the building and into the monster training field. This was where all the jocks who work specifically in the mob-slaying aspect of training go to compete. The biggest mob they ever had there was aghast, but that was also the year that the field was set on fire. Norman and his friends stepped out onto the giant field. He noticed that all the younger students had come to watch. Apparently, that was supposed to happen, and Norman felt even more nervous when he realized that these tests were going to be shown to the entire school. Around him were his friends, enemies, and acquaintances. Every one of them wanted to gain their new names and powers. Most of the people there were beginning to grow restless, and finally Norman heard Boris announcing that the tests would begin. The crowd of test-takers and the stands of younger students fell silent as soon as the announcement was made. Norman stood on his tiptoes to get a glimpse of Boris standing behind a podium made of wooden planks. His naturally loud voice boomed through the field. "All right. Now that we can begin, I believe that the first event is the test of strength. You must pick one hostile mob to fight, and it can be any at all. Harder mobs will give you a better score if you can beat them, but if you can't you will be downgraded. Simpler mobs will give you a lower score, but are easier to defeat, so you won't have to worry about losing. Now, if you do lose to an easy mob, you will be severely downgraded. Now then, Coach Cobblestone will be directing you," he explained, gesturing towards the tall and muscular coach standing beside him. Coach Cobblestone stepped into better view and set everyone into a single file line according to their first names. "Okay, shrimps. You all will get one weapon to choose from and one piece of armor when you fight, so choose wisely. Now then, I will call you up to fight in alphabetical order and by age, so everyone just be patient." The coach took out an empty map that had been fashioned into a list of names and began to read aloud. "All right. First up is Aaron." Norman felt it was kind of weird to just say people's first names, but here it seemed pretty normal. Aaron was a younger short kid, smaller than Lizzie even, who seemed to be nervous all the time. He walked up cautiously, and suddenly he managed to trip on flat ground, which caused a few people to snicker. Coach Cobblestone looked around at the crowd and said, "Hey. If I hear any of you kids giggling back there, you're all gonna be flunked and you'll be spending a week carrying cobblestone in your block packs and nothing else, so shut it. Yeah, I said it, for that you'll be held back and given extra homework even if you pass these tests. Now then, Aaron, which mob are you going to choose?" Aaron whimpered slightly as he stood back up, and said the weakest mob he could think of. Silverfish. Please." Yeah?" he sputtered, obviously terrified out of his mind. Coach Cobblestone nodded and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Bring out a silverfish." About 5 feet from Aaron's position spawned a single silverfish. It located Aaron quickly and made a little hiss. Without even taking time to snatch up a weapon, Aaron screamed at the top of his lungs and ran out of the field. No one moved for about a second, and Coach Cobblestone quickly ended the silence. Okay. Now then, let's just continue on without Aaron. Alex, you're next." Norman watched student after student come up to face a mob. Almost all of them passed the test except for a few people who picked mobs too hard like blazes and witches. Something surprising happened when one girl named Bailey came up and decided to face a creeper. When the monster came out, everyone found out that she was a mob whisperer for creepers. The creeper instantly became her new pet, and rolled over like a dog for her to rub its belly, hissing in a friendly way. Even Bailey had no idea this would happen, but she accepted it as a good surprise. She named the creeper Butterball, and it followed her for the rest of the day. And unfortunately for Norman, his turn came up a little too quickly, and his heart gave a jump when he heard his name. Norman quietly walked through the crowd to get to the front, ignoring Danny's idiotic snickers. He had passed with flying colors by slicing the head off a blaze within 4 seconds of its spawning, so he was cocky. "All right, son, what mob are you gonna pick, huh?" asked Coach Cobblestone. Norman hadn't taken time to think over his decision, and he said the first mob that came to his mind. Everyone was looking at him, and he felt his throat dry up for a few seconds. "I think I'll pick the Enderman." The entire crowd fell silent at that point. Coach Cobblestone was the only one who praised him on his courage, and he brought out an Enderman instantly. The Enderman towered over the students, and everyone was smart enough not to make eye contact. Everyone was looking at the ground while the Enderman scanned his surroundings. Norman still looked at the Enderman, though. It was his mob to fight. With caution, Norman crept over to a table where many items were scattered, all types of armor and weapons. You could even pick tools to use, so technically you could fight a mob with a fishing pole or shears if you wanted. Norman's favorite material ever was diamond. He loved it as much as everyone else, so it was something he wasn't laughed at for. So, Norman walked over and picked up a diamond shovel and a pair of diamond boots. These were his 2 favorites. He was glad everyone had their eyes glued to the floor, because someone would have laughed at him because of his choice. He even didn't know why diamond shovels were more appealing to him than swords. Once Norman had the diamond shovel and the boots equipped, he looked back up at the Enderman. It was staring off in the opposite direction of where he was. Norman approached the Enderman slowly, and the moment he stepped 1 foot forward, the Enderman whirled around and started racing towards him, his mouth agape and his eyes pulsing with a deep violet glow. Norman backed up quickly because of the unexpected attack. The Enderman swiped at him with its long arms and tried to ram into him to push him over. Norman knew picking the Enderman was a stupid choice, but nevertheless he knew how to beat it. Norman had played and lived Minecraft for a long time, and he had developed enough skills to do well. As soon as the Enderman jolted towards him in one burst, he smacked it in the chest with his diamond shovel, and it made a grunting noise and teleported, leaving a trail of purple snowflakes. Norman watched the trail of the snowflakes and spotted the Enderman coming back from about 7 blocks away. Again he whacked the Enderman with his diamond shovel and it teleported once more. Norman repeated this process for about 30 more seconds, and he was sure that the Enderman was nearly finished. But then, just as he was about to hit the Enderman for a final blow, the Enderman teleported directly behind him and whacked him in the back. Norman flopped onto the ground and let out a gasp. He looked up and saw that everyone was now watching him now that the Enderman was already angry at him. He looked and saw Danny chuckling in the front with his thugs, pointing stupidly at him. But Norman was being a little too oblivious, because the Enderman did something then that it was never supposed to do. Something only an Enderman being controlled by the era could do. It picked him up and crumpled him into an obtainable block. It was the most pain Norman had ever felt in his life, and he felt like he was being crushed by 1,000 pounds of obsidian. Suddenly, he felt himself being dropped to the ground in his normal form. His vision had turned foggy, and his body ached terribly. He had just enough strength to look up and see Coach Cobblestone taking out a diamond sword. The coach killed the Enderman himself, and it dropped a single ender pearl. Coach Cobblestone quickly ran over to Norman and helped him up. "Son, you okay? That Enderman must have been plagued by the terror thing," he muttered angrily. Norman stood up with shaky legs and caught hold of the coach's shoulder while he caught his breath. "Are you sure you can do the rest of the tests, Norman?" asked Coach Cobblestone. Norman nodded and walked back into the crowd, still feeling a little sickened. Just as he was entering the crowd, Danny had yelled at the top of his lungs, "Hey, noobman! What's it like being square-headed?" The crowd of students howled with laughter, and Norman felt his cheeks burn intensely, and he hid himself quickly among the crowd. Coach Cobblestone shushed the crowd soon after and speedily finished up the trial of strength for the rest of the students. Norman pushed the entire scene out of his mind when he heard Headmaster Boris come back up to the podium and declare that the trial of wits was coming next. This challenge involved quite a lot of thinking, and Norman grinned at the thought of how Danny would go through it. All of the students gathered on the top right corner of the field where there was only a single chest. Coach Cobblestone brought up everyone in the same manner as before. Every challenge was different for each student, so Norman grumbled at not having the advantage of watching other people's strategies. Someone had to arrange colored wool in order of appearance in the world of Minecraft, while someone else had to figure out how to create all possible infinite sources. Norman came up a little more confidently than last time, because he was much stronger in these parts of units, and stood up straight when he reached the front of the crowd. Coach Cobblestone pulled a small slip of paper from a chest from random and read it aloud. Challenge number 64, name all of the possible items and blocks that do not stack up to 64. Do this within 2 minutes and you will succeed. Your time starts now. Norman ran through all the blocks in his head and listed off all the things he could. Mushroom stew, snowballs, cake, water bucket, lava bucket, milk bucket, all armor, all weapons, and all tools. Norman watched nervously as the coach looked at the answer sheet. After skimming the list, he said to Norman, "Oh man, you only got 8 out of 14 right. You missed chicken eggs, sign, ender pearls, dragon eggs, and monster spawners. Also, not all tools aren't stackable. Compasses and clocks are stackable to 64. That scores a 57%. Sorry kid, that's an F." Norman froze in place as the laughter from his classmates blasted in his ears. He wasn't even sure where he was for a moment. He didn't even notice when Coach Cobblestone pushed him back into the crowd of students so that they could continue. Norman's thoughts were racing around in his head. He had seen before that he was given a 79%, C+, on the trial of strength, and now he's got an F. He was averaging at a D+ so far, and he had a feeling he might have to be held back if he didn't do perfect on the next tests. Norman shook his head to bring himself into reality, and he promised himself he'd get a perfect score on the next 2 trials. After everyone had finished the trial of wits, they moved to the top left corner of the field for the trial of flexibility. For this trial, you were tested on how well you could adapt to situations. There were a varying array of habitats set up there. One by one students would have to come up and be put in a random mini-biome area. They would be given different situations for their area and they'd have to solve it within 30 seconds. Once Norman came up, he heard many snickers from the crowd. He looked over and noticed Patrick and Lizzie standing up front, and thankfully they were both giving him a thumbs up. Norman didn't feel that much better, because he remembered that Lizzie was passing so far with a B and Patrick had an A, so they had nothing to worry about yet. Norman stepped into a normal plains biome. Suddenly, he heard someone shouting at him. Coach Cobblestone was giving directions. "All right, a nasty thunderstorm is beginning, and you are on the peak of a large hill just under the clouds. Become safe from the lightning within 30 seconds. Go!" he exclaimed. As Norman found himself standing atop a mountain and a random, yet rough, thunderstorm rolled in, he quickly slammed his fist at the dirt underneath him and dug his way down 5 blocks until he was standing on stone. He then made a hollowed-out room that was merely 3 by 3. In his last 2 seconds he placed a leftover dirt block above him and shut himself away from the terrible storm. It was pitch black inside, and Norman just heard Coach Cobblestone's voice from outside. New situation. You are now underground, standing on the edge of a ravine with only a stone pickaxe, and lava is flowing far below. Get to the other edge of the ravine without falling. You have 30 seconds, go. Norman then found himself standing on the short ledge of a small ravine, lava bubbling below. He had to cross a gap that was 5 blocks long. Norman wasted no time and began to mine the rock in behind him until he had 5 blocks of it. He then spent his last 20 sneaking along the edge of the blocks he was standing on, but soon he had only 2 seconds left. He forgot about placing the last block and instead he jumped onto the other ledge on the opposite side of the ravine. Thankfully, he made the jump and didn't fall into the lava below. Again Coach Cobblestone's voice echoed from somewhere far off. Final challenge. You are being swarmed by 30 spiders in the middle of a plains biome. Stay alive for the 30 seconds you have. Remember, spiders are slightly faster than you. You have 30 seconds, go. Norman was then teleported into a small area of plains. That same instant, 30 spiders appeared 3 blocks away from his position. Norman decided to sprint that time to avoid the spiders, and as a result he had gone down to a low hunger amount. The spiders were starting to catch up with still 23 seconds, so Norman used that time to gather at exactly 8 blocks of dirt. The spiders were only 5 blocks away by the time he had built a 4-block-high tower with 4 ledges, 1 on each end. This prevented any spiders from climbing up and killing him for the last 5 seconds of his time. Coach Cobblestone slammed hard on a note block, signaling the end of the 3 tests within the trial of flexibility. Norman was transported back onto the grounds of the field, and he found himself finally standing in front of Coach Cobblestone. The coach read to him his scores aloud once he had appeared. Not bad, kid. You scored an 8 out of 10 for the first situation, 9.5 out of 10 for the second, and a 9 out of 10 for the final one. That averages out to an 88%, so that's a B+. Alright Oliver, you're up next, called Coach Cobblestone. Norman ran the numbers through his head again, and now he had a total average of a C. He was still nervous, because that's not exactly the greatest score. After every student had finished the trial of flexibility, the final trial was going to take place. The last one was the trial of problem solving. This one was specialized on how well you could use the given objects to make something or survive against a certain attack in under 10 minutes. Norman felt he was pretty good at this, and he was confident he'd do even better this time. The entire group of students walked over to the bottom left corner of the field where there were also many different biomes set up. Coach Cobblestone ran through the rules and began to send students into the biomes at random. Once it was Norman's turn, he was ushered into his biome. Norman found himself being put in a blazing desert. They even had fires lit underneath his biome replica to make it blistering hot. Norman was told to build a house that was zombie-proof. He only had 10 minutes, and he made the most out of his time. He was only given 1 skeleton spawn egg, 1 block of dirt, 1 crafting table, 16 sticky pistons, and 1 spruce sapling. And he was required to use a door. Norman only had to think for about 5 seconds before he knew what to do. Norman spawned the skeleton, which shot at him instantly. But Norman dodged the first arrow and punched the skeleton to death. It dropped an arrow and 2 bones. He set down his crafting table and converted the bones into bone meal. He then placed the block of dirt and planted the spruce sapling. He then gave some bone meal to the sapling and it grew to a full-sized tree. Once he had obtained 5 wood blocks and had turned them into wooden planks, he found that he had 9 more minutes. He ran to his crafting table and made 2 wooden pickaxes. For 2 more minutes he mined down and found the 6 blocks of iron ore he needed for his doors and enough cobblestone for the furnaces and buttons. After Norman had built multiple furnaces and had begun to smelt 6 iron ingot with his leftover wooden planks, he obtained enough sand and sandstone to make a 3x3 house within 30 seconds, and it took 30 more seconds to build his makeshift fort. The roof was only 3 blocks high, and had a sandstone floor and roof. In only 1 more minute, Norman took his new iron ingot and leftover cobblestone and crafted an iron door and 2 buttons. He made an entrance with the iron door and placed a button on both sides of the block above it. His home was finished, and he still had 5 minutes to spare. He zoomed back in his puny iron mine and mined 3 more iron to make an iron pickaxe, and he still had 1 wooden plank left to make sticks. Once acquiring his iron pickaxe in just under a minute, Norman dug like crazy into the ground, and finally found 1 block of redstone ore. By the time Norman had come back up, he only had a minute and a half left. Norman quickly dug a 2-block deep pit around his house and then made his way back out. He used his small amount of redstone, his sticky pistons, and his leftover materials to make a trap. When he turned the newly made switch, it would power each sticky piston using the redstone and would take away the blocks above the surrounding zombies, sending them into the pit. Norman unfortunately did not have time to test his trap, because his time was up. Just as he was rushing inside his makeshift house, Coach Cobblestone called out, "All right, time's up. Bring in the wave of zombies," declared the coach. 15 zombies spawned 2 blocks from the house, and they all were able to see Norman inside through the door, so they began to mutter and gurgle and surround the iron door. Norman laughed at the zombies because they couldn't get in, and he decided to relish a new moment by using his trap. Norman flipped the switch and immediately heard the sticky pistons doing their job. But for some reason, Norman's trap backfired, and he had accidentally wired the pistons incorrectly, because the redstone connections were cancelling each other out, causing the pistons to move out and then immediately back in. This caused all 4 sides of Norman's sand walls to fall down into the pit instead, leaving the corners of the house and the roof alone. Norman was standing there wide open. Just as the zombies were about to swarm around and kill him, Coach Cobblestone slammed his fist down on the note block, and the zombies all disappeared. Norman was full of dread as he walked over to Coach Cobblestone. He was looking over the score sheet, and he sighed just before he read it aloud. "In this challenge, you used your time perfectly up until you decided to make the zombie trap. You should have just left your house alone after that, because redstone traps take more time than you used. Redstone wiring can sometimes be tricky, and this trap resulted in sending your sand walls into the pit, leaving you completely exposed. I'm going to have to take off points for that. Let's see, I believe you got a 70% or in other words a C, so at least it's not an F," he decided. Norman hoped that the coach wasn't insulting him on purpose and that he didn't mean to hurt his feelings. Norman had to run his final scores through his head once more. His stomach tightened when he got the answer. He finished at an average of 74%, so he was still at a C. Norman felt like crying for a few moments, but then remembered that everyone else was still around, all waiting for the final trial to be over. Once the last person had finished the trial of problem solving, it was time for each student to gather in the commons again to receive their block powers. Norman almost didn't want to gain anything at all, because he was afraid of what he would get. But like everyone else, he followed Boris and Carlos the Bat into the commons. The ceremony was about to begin. Chapter 8, The Block-Bearing Ceremony. The ceremony at the end of 4 trials was called the Block-Bearing Ceremony, a surprisingly similar name compared to the day itself. People were chatting quietly as they entered Diamond University once again. The test had gone all the way until sunset, so the sky was beginning to turn dim and the sun glowed a beautiful red. Even the pretty sunset couldn't take Norman's mind off his scores. He had done terrible on all the tests except for the third one, and now he ended with a C. He felt humiliated as he settled amongst the crowd and ran his thoughts through his head. Eventually, Lizzie and Patrick found him. They both looked excited, which didn't help Norman at all. Lizzie looked up at Patrick and said, "This is great. I averaged as an A on the tests." Patrick grinned and folded his arms together. "Yeah, I just barely finished with an A+ at a 98%. What did you get?" asked Patrick as he looked down at Norman, who was avoiding his gaze. Norman didn't respond for about 5 seconds, but he figured they would bug him until they found out, so he grumbled and turned to look at them. "I averaged out on a C, so shut up." Lizzie's mouth dropped open and she looked at him in disbelief. "What? I think they gave you totally unfair scores on those tests. Plus, the trial of strength was so stupid. It wasn't your fault you lost to that Enderman. That thing did things it wasn't supposed to. And yet, they take off points for that. Ugh, sometimes I hate teachers," she grumbled. Norman felt immediately better that Lizzie felt angry and annoyed like him. Patrick looked like he was about to say something, but he stopped and pointed up at the podium where Boris had before stood. Norman turned round to see that he was there again. Instead of a podium, now there was a 3-block-long table. On each tabletop was a glowing bucket. The first one was a bucket of water that glowed blue, then a bucket of lava that glowed red, and finally a bucket of milk that glowed white. Boris's face turned serious and he stopped smiling as he began to announce the beginning of the ceremony. "All right, everyone. Now that the 4 trials have finally finished, it is now time for the block-bearing ceremony to begin. I will call you by first name in alphabetical order and of age to come up and be categorized. When you are called up, you will drink from each of these buckets. 2 of them will taste terrible, but 1 will taste as sweet as honey. Whichever you drank from that was sweet is how you will be determined. Now then, I will begin the ceremony at once," declared Boris. Boris held out a sheet of paper and began to read off names. First up was Aaron. Aaron nervously walked up to the tables holding the glowing buckets of liquid. He obediently drank from each of them. He told Boris that the water tasted sweet as honey, and in response Boris declared Aaron's placement to the entire crowd. "You have been chosen by the Water of Prosperity to become of aircraft. I hereby bestow upon you the block power of Pumpkin, the rich and intimidating. You will live as Aaron Pumpkin for the rest of your life. May Notch bestow his blessings upon you," declared Boris. Boris then called up the next person, Alex. Alex was more confident than Aaron, and he stepped up with eagerness. He tasted each of the buckets and told Boris that the lava tasted sweet. Boris declared the newest decision. "You have been chosen by the Lava of Power to become a Dungeoneer. I hereby bestow up you the block power of Anvil, the heavy-duty and durable. You will live as Alex Anvil for the rest of your life. May Notch bestow his blessings upon you," declared Boris. Norman watched as Lizzie went up and became of aircraft with the block power of Cake. Patrick soon after became a Dungeoneer with the block power of Obsidian. Norman normally would have congratulated them, but he was so worried about getting a useless block power that he was distracted. One by one students would come up and receive their powers. Norman figured that the milk bucket must have been for the odd blocks. No one had been picked to be an odd block yet, and everyone seemed relieved about that. Unfortunately, Danny had received bedrock powers, so Norman kept in mind that he would have to avoid him from now on. Norman couldn't decide what was worse, being an odd block or not getting any placement. Norman didn't feel sorry for Bailey at all, because now that people knew she was a mob whisperer for creepers, she didn't have to take any of the exams and she didn't even need to attend the block-bearing ceremony. Once Boris had reached the middle of the list, he called Norman up to the tables. Norman took a deep breath and decided he would just get it over with. Once Norman had reached the tables, he groaned when he noticed that Molly Dirt's slab, who hadn't gotten a placement at all and wasn't exactly the smartest knife in the drawer, had slobbered her fat lips all over every bucket. Norman had to clean off each of them with his shirt before it was sanitary. He drank from the water of prosperity, and he experienced a terribly bitter taste. He sputtered and then moved on to the lava of power. He drank from that, and nearly choked when he realized that it tasted 10 times worse. Norman then looked at the milk bucket on the end. His stomach twisted into a knot when he realized that the milk was his only choice. He reluctantly drank from the milk bucket, which unfortunately tasted like honey. He pushed it back and looked up at Boris, who was waiting patiently. "There. The milk tastes sweet, sir," he murmured, half hoping he was too quiet. But Boris heard him, and announced his humiliating placement. "You have been chosen by the Milk of Mystery to become an odd block. I hereby bestow upon you the block power of Cobweb, the barricading and clustered. You will live as Norman Cobweb for the rest of your life. May Notch bestow his blessings upon you." Norman's body manually walked back into the crowd, but his mind numbed up completely. Once it came back into reality, it blasted him with the words, "You are a cobweb, you loser." Over and over. He could have been standing there all night if Lizzie hadn't shaken him awake at the end of the block-bearing ceremony. "Norman? Are you okay?" she asked. Norman still stared off into nowhere. Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered. Lizzie put on her best concerned look to try and get Norman to snap out of it. "Norman, come on. Don't be sad all the time. I'm going to open my own bakery, and I promise that if I make some good sales then I will give you some goods to trade with people for food. We're only allowed to stay here for the night, and then we have to go out on our own. Don't worry, I promise I'll let you live with me in the bakery. I'm not able to get any cobblestone or wooden planks, so we'll have to build a room in the side of the mountain outside of the village since I can't rent space. Come on, you need some sleep after this," promised Lizzie. Norman felt a little better at her offer, and he looked around to see where Patrick had gone to. He didn't see him anywhere, and he decided that he was possibly already up in his room getting ready for bed. Norman followed Lizzie all the way up to the 3rd floor and they went down the hallway until they had both reached their rooms. After bidding Lizzie a good night, Norman opened the door to his room, stepped inside, and shut it again. Norman flopped down on his bed, and out of his exhaustion from the day he instantly fell asleep. Unfortunately, his dreams were constantly full of cobwebs, which annoyed him greatly. The next morning when Norman awoke from his poor sleep, he heard someone rapping on his door. It was his elderly brewing teacher, Professor Netherwart. "Gordon, it is time for you to depart. Graduating students must leave the university in the morning." "Eh? Are you in the Gordon?" he murmured. Norman grumbled loudly to signify he was getting up and reminded the professor for the millionth time that his name was Norman and not Gordon. So Professor Netherwart finally bid Gordon a good day and left. Norman listened to the professor's footsteps until they were gone, and he jumped out of bed. He had agreed to meet Lizzie outside of their rooms at 7 o'clock that morning, so Norman kicked into high gear as he packed away his stuff. Norman never had very much stuff with him, and if anything he had supplies for his classes. His only possessions were his weapon and his armor. He loved diamond so much that he had a full set of it, which he wore in his training when he was allowed to use it, along with his diamond shovel. He was laughed at for this because of using a diamond shovel, but he didn't care at all. His main weapon was actually his diamond shovel, which he had yet to name. Norman learned quickly that items with a limited durability had a health bar printed on them, and he had used his diamond shovel enough where if he used it once more it would break, and he didn't want to have to go mining secretly again. He didn't have any iron to make an anvil, so he couldn't name it or fix it yet. Norman put his well-used diamond armor in his inventory inside his block pack, but kept his diamond shovel out. Thankfully, it looked good as new no matter what condition it was in, so Norman didn't look shabby. This also applied to all other limited items, besides the anvil. Once Norman had his things stored in his backpack, he stepped outside to find Lizzie waiting for him. Her favorite weapon was really a lot cooler than Norman's. She had found this nerdy kid named Greg in one of her monster-slaying classes that was wielding a weapon only from mods outside of the regular world of Minecraft. He was carrying a sickle made of diamond, which did only deal about 1.5 hearts of damage. Although it was weak, you could strike with it 3 times as fast, so you could deal 4.5 hearts of damage in 1 second. The only bad thing was that it had almost no knockback. Lizzie had watched Greg every day for weeks in the training gym, and finally she had enough courage to go up and ask to trade. For the first few weeks, he always refused to give up his diamond sickle and he never revealed how he found his mod weapon. But after an entire 3 weeks of her begging him, he finally made her a deal. Greg said that if she was able to sneak into the kitchen next to the commons and get him Headmaster Boris' entire secret stash of cheese, which was a precious mod food he was trying to obtain through secret processes, and get it back to him, he would give her his sickle. Well, Lizzie was so desperate that she sweet-talked Professor Netherwart into giving her an invisibility potion and stole Boris' cheese stash. Once she had given Greg the cheese in return, she got the diamond sickle, which to her annoyance was already half used. But she kept it without complaining, and she too had always been waiting to fix and name it with an anvil. When Lizzie spotted Norman coming down the hallway, she ran towards him in a hurry, grasping her sickle in her left hand. She was nearly vibrating with excitement, and she couldn't wait to get started with her day as an independent graduate. Norman. I've been waiting forever to start the day, and I wanted to wait for you. Come on, the first thing we need to do is set up my new bakery, declared Lizzie. They threw the hallway, down the stairs, and then into the commons as quickly as they could. There were many other students exiting the building. Norman looked around nervously, not wanting to come across Danny and be trapped in a prison of bedrock. Once again Patrick was nowhere to be seen, and Norman began to wonder where he had gone to. As Norman and Lizzie stepped out into the cool morning air, Norman had a sense of a new beginning. It was his new beginning. Chapter 9, A New Beginning. Norman and Lizzie immediately set to work on the new bakery. The two walked through the streets until they reached the edge of town. They went about 5 blocks outside the town's boundaries and they began their bakery in the side of a tall slope on the mountain rising above them. After digging a 6x8 room in the side of the mountain, Norman and Lizzie stepped back to look at their new home. At this time, Lizzie turned to Norman and said, "All right, now all we need is some wood. Got any?" Norman shook his head, and instead he turned around to face the rest of the Mushroom Island. "No, but I'm sure we can chop down some." "Oh." As Norman looked out at the terrain before him, he didn't see a single tree anywhere. The only growing plants were the 2 different kinds of giant mushrooms, and even those weren't that abundant. He turned back to Lizzie after thinking a bit. How are we going to get wood on a Mushroom Island biome? I mean, the people living here must have gotten wood imported from another place in the overworld in order to build houses and begin an economy. I mean, now people must have enough trees growing in a greenhouse somewhere that they don't need to rely on other civilizations. Only thing is, I'm sure we can't just walk into Mayor Mushroom's office and ask for free saplings," muttered Norman, trying to think of a solution. Lizzie frowned when she heard that and scratched her neck. "Well, do we know anyone who would give us some saplings?" Both Norman and Lizzie were quiet for a moment, but then they had the same idea within a few seconds. "Jeff Ironblock," they said in unison. Norman and Lizzie left their work in progress to go find Jeff Ironblock. Jeff had stuck with them for their whole year at Diamond University, supplying them with everything they needed for their classes. They figured that he could spare them a few saplings. Once they reached his house, they knocked quickly on the door. A few seconds went by before Esmeralda answered the door. She was not carrying Jonah at the moment, who was 14 months old already. She smiled when she saw the two and she said, "Well, hello, kids. Would you like to come in and see Jeff?" The two nodded and stepped inside. As they walked down a small hallway, they saw Jonah playing with bone meal in his new bedroom. Norman and Lizzie turned to the right at the end of the hallway to find a dead end. There was a switch attached on the ceiling above, and when Norman flipped it, the dead end opened up into Jeff's armory. They stepped inside and were greeted with a smoking scent wafting through the air. Jeff was in the corner of the room waiting for some iron to smelt. Norman cleared his throat as he and Lizzie entered the room, and Jeff turned his head at the sound. Once seeing Norman and Lizzie, he walked up to them and looked down with a grin on his face. "Hey guys. What block power did you receive at the ceremony?" he asked eagerly. Norman looked down at the floor and didn't say anything, so Lizzie answered instead. "Well, I was chosen to be of aircraft and I got the block power of cake. And, Norman didn't do so well on the tests because of Coach Cobblestone's stupid rules and he got the block power of cobweb, and now he's an odd block." Jeff's face fell instantly once he had processed the news in his head. "Oh, really? Why would they give you such a terrible block power? How did they score you on the tests?" asked Jeff. Norman looked up at Jeff's crestfallen expression and explained the whole thing. When he was finished, Jeff gained an angry look on his face. "What? When I was taking the tests at your age, Coach Cobblestone always give a fair score. But now, I think he's getting too old for his job. The score you got on the trial of strength I think is the worst. That Enderman was being controlled by the error. So there was no reason you should be getting such a bad score for something unnaturally occurring like that. I just think everything has gone downhill ever since the error has appeared again," muttered Jeff. Jeff took out his well-used armor from his previous battle against a horde of zombies and was about to repair it on his anvil when he looked at the shovel and sickle in their hands. "Say, can I help you with your shovel and—" Whoa! Jeff dropped his armor to the floor with a clang. Is that a sickle you're holding? I've only heard legends about secret weapons hidden in the spaces between our dimension and others that only the most skillful scientists can access, but I've never thought they were actually true. Wow! Where did you get that sickle, Lizzie?" murmured Jeff. Lizzie smiled as she let a mesmerized Jeff hold the diamond sickle. "Well, let's just say I know one of the youngest and most skillful scientists in the overworld who made a deal with me for it. I saw him using the sickle a lot and I finally was able to take it off his hands, though he never did tell me where he got it. Anyways, do you think you could repair the diamond sickle and shovel for us?" asked Lizzie. Jeff grinned and immediately placed the diamond sickle on the anvil in front of him. "Definitely. I just got a ton of experience from the battle, and lately I've been saving it, so I have about 80 full bars of it. Do you have armor you need to be repaired?" Both Norman and Lizzie handed him their full sets of diamond armor. He had enough experience for everything including his own things, and when he was repairing the diamond sickle, he lifted his head and said, "Do you want to name it? I have plenty extra experience here. So name it anything you want." Lizzie thought about that for a moment, and finally she replied after about 10 seconds of silence. "I think I'll call it something cool like, maybe quick and painless? No, too long. Crap, I can't think of anything. Oh, I know. I'm gonna call it Shine," decided Lizzie. As Jeff was inputting the name in the little bar above where the weapon was placed, Norman suddenly realized something. "Jeff, "How are you repairing the sickle if you only have one?" he inquired. Jeff gave a little shrug. "Well, I was wondering that up until I put it down. Apparently, I don't need to put in another sickle to repair it. I'm thinking that these special weapons were designed to be repaired without a counterpart so that the important scientists who obtained them would be able to preserve it for a much longer period. Or at least that's my guess," said Jeff as he finished repairing the diamond sickle now named Shine. Lizzie took back Shine and held it in her hands. Norman agreed that Shine was the perfect name for the diamond sickle, because it gleamed with a sleek and glossy surface when even the dimmest amounts of light reflected off of it. Lizzie looked close and saw that the name was even printed in fancy lettering in the blade. Norman stepped up and held out his diamond shovel. Jeff took it and raised an eyebrow. "Your favorite weapon is a diamond shovel? Ah, never mind, I'm not gonna argue. When I was in my second year at Diamond University, I became friends with this guy who is now named Kent Ice, and his favorite weapon of choice was actually a different mod, a diamond fishing pole. So if you ever get teased about having a diamond shovel as your weapon, just remember old Kent and his fishing pole," suggested Jeff. As Jeff was putting down Norman's diamond shovel with a spare one from the chest behind him, he asked the same question as he asked Lizzie. "Do you want to name this shovel? I can do that if you want, so name it anything you want," he offered. Norman thought hard about that. Whatever he named it would be what he would stick with until he no longer had it in his hands, so he needed to think of something he would want to keep. After thinking long and hard about how he would name a shovel, he decided on something. "I'm going to call it Shatter, because any future enemies I face will be shattered by its heavy blows," Norman declared in a both heroic and dorky way. Jeff grinned a little and repaired the diamond shovel until it was good as new. Norman held Shatter in hands and had a sudden urge to beat up a creeper with it. Norman and Lizzie didn't feel the need to name their armor, so Jeff ran through both sets quickly and still had enough to spare for himself. After Jeff finished his repair on his iron helmet, Norman remembered the reason they had come to his house in the first place. Jeff?" Jeff grunted to show he was listening. "Can we ask one more favor of you?" Jeff snapped his fingers and leaned back on his severely damaged anvil. "Shoot," he said, holding up a finger and pointing at them. "Can we get a few saplings so that we can make some wooden planks? Lizzie and I are making a bakery so we can get started on our new lives." Jeff immediately stepped towards his chest and pulled out 3 birch saplings, a diamond hoe, 20 blocks of dirt, and an entire full stack of bone meal. He also gave them both a bed so that they could sleep at night. They had everything they needed to get some wooden planks for the bakery. As soon as they had received their supplies, Norman and Lizzie thanked Jeff greatly for his generosity and left the house. It was around lunchtime, and both Norman and Lizzie were hungry by the time they had reached their little cave in the side of the mountain. Norman knew that the mycelium ground would overpower the normal dirt unless it was turned into farmland, so Norman made quick work of planting the trees and giving them bone meal, then planting more and giving those bone meal. After about 5 minutes of planting and feeding the saplings bone meal and chopping down trees, Norman had obtained 2 stacks of birch wood, which they converted into exactly 512 birchwood planks. After replacing their mycelium cave walls, floor, and ceiling with birchwood planks, Norman and Lizzie fixed up the inside by making a wooden counter accessible through a fence gate. Lizzie made a crafting table behind the wooden counter and made 2 entrance doors separated by wooden columns. Lizzie looked around at their dark room and realized that they needed some light. Norman solved this problem and took a wooden pickaxe. He created a back room behind the wooden counter and created their own little mine. He mined out some cobblestone for furnaces and found a stack of 10 coal, which he made torches out of. After placing some torches in the corners of the room, the whole place was lit with a warm orange light. Norman and Lizzie stepped outside to admire their little room in their side of the mountain, which didn't look half bad. As a finishing touch, Lizzie crafted a sign and placed it on the wooden planks separating the two entrance doors. On the sign she wrote Fizzy Lizzie's Bakery. As she stepped back and admired her sign, Norman looked at it and grumbled. "Lizzie, I'm not sure that everyone will enjoy your nickname," he muttered. But Lizzie kept the sign like that anyway. Norman hadn't had any lunch, and by the time they were finished with the bakery, the sun was beginning to set and it was time for dinner.